Welcome back to Malden's Revolution. I'm Mark Linehan. 250 years ago today, on June 14th, 1776, 3 months after the evacuation of Boston and just over a year after the Battle of Chelsea Creek, the militia of Malden concludes another military operation, where they were again ordered to take action against the British in Boston Harbor. But this time, it's not the British food supply that's the target, but the British Navy itself. It's been almost 3 months exactly since the British evacuated the town of Boston, with nearly 10,000 British troops, along with approximately 1,000 loyalists and their families, fleeing in an armada for Halifax, Nova Scotia. But while March 17th may have been the day that the British soldiers and civilians evacuated, that was not the day that all their ships left. The Americans do not have the ability to prevent the British from returning to Boston. The British Navy outclassed and outnumbered any and all ships available to the rebelling colonists throughout the war. In fact, the Royal Navy will remain larger than the United States Navy until the middle of World War II. Since the colonies could not hope to match the British at sea, Massachusetts had no choice but to build up its shore defenses, in particular, the entrances into Boston Harbor. The Massachusetts Council of Safety assigned this enormously important task to General Benjamin Lincoln, the man who had helped plan the logistics that enabled the colonial response to the battles of Lexington and Concord to become a siege. Promoted to Major General after the British evacuation, Benjamin Lincoln recognized that American coastal defenses had to be strengthened. But before we could properly fortify the coasts, we would have to get the remaining straggling British ships in the outer harbor to leave. Even though there are no American vessels that could compare in guns or tonnage to many of the British Navy's largest ships, they cannot compete with the daring and courage of America's first naval commanders. One of the most active captains in Boston Harbor after the evacuation of the British Army is Captain Daniel Waters of the town of Malden. Captain Daniel Waters was the subject of one of our Patriot profiles last year, and his successes during the siege of Boston made him a nationally known figure, celebrated as a great American hero by the likes of George Washington, John Hancock, and John Adams. Captain Waters has been in command of the schooner Lee since January. The Lee is a modest ship carrying 8 guns and a crew of 50, but Captain Daniel Waters ranked second only to Commodore John Manley, who commanded the fleet of ships that George Washington used to harass British shipping during the siege of Boston. Captain Waters had captured several valuable prizes in the last 6 months, but in May, Waters and his crew had helped capture a ship with 1,500 barrels of gunpowder on board, along with 1,000 carbines and other cargo. The ship in its entirety was valued at over 40,000 pounds sterling. But in June, Captain Waters managed to capture a troop ship with nearly 100 Highlanders on board, along with almost 40 sailors and 40 cannon. These successes undoubtedly emboldened General Lincoln to make a direct assault against the remaining British naval forces in the southern part of Boston Harbor. The bulk of the British Navy, including a 50-gun warship called the Commodore Banks, were hiding behind a peninsula on the south shore called Nantasket, and the main thrust of General Lincoln's operation in June of 1776 was attacking this fleet and securing all the islands in Boston Harbor south of the city. But while Nantasket was the large peninsula blocking the southern entrance to Boston Harbor, General Lincoln had to make sure he had secured the northern peninsula protecting the harbor, an area of land well known to Malden's Revolution viewers here in today's city of Winthrop. Today, you can drive from Winthrop onto Deer Island where I'm standing now, but 250 years ago, this strip of land was a main channel for getting from the Atlantic into Boston. It's still a popular approach today, not for ships, but for planes. To support his operation south of Boston, General Benjamin Lincoln sends a direct order to the town of Malden, ordering that at 3 p.m. on June 13th, they are to march 50 men to Point Shirley, quote, completely well armed with 2 days' provision, and to remain there. You'll remember from our Evacuation Day episode that Captain Naylor Hatch's company of men was immediately redeployed to New York the day after the British evacuated Boston. But while those men were considered part of the Continental Army under the overall command of Colonel William Bond, Malden's militia remains home and still under the command of Captain Benjamin Blaney. On June 13th, Captain Blaney and 56 men under his command marched to Point Shirley, prepared for a direct confrontation with the most powerful navy on Earth. So why is this the first time you've ever heard of the Great Battle of Point Shirley? Simple. It never happened. There was a great deal of fighting in the harbor south of Boston in mid-June, and hopefully there's a Hingham's Revolution or a Hull's Revolution making a video about it. Or you could look up a landmark called Boston Light. But north of Boston, nuttin'. There doesn't seem to have been any real fighting here at Point Shirley or Deer Island. There's one account that says the men of Malden may have fired at some British ships within range, but after being forced out of the harbor by General Lincoln and the militias of the South Shore, the remaining elements of the British Navy retreated from Massachusetts, and this time, for good. Captain Blaney and his men returned to Malden, all present and accounted for, having suffered no casualties, which may have contributed to why the incident is little remembered. Much like the Battle of Chelsea Creek, the total lack of American casualties meant there were no grieving families insisting we never forget the sacrifices of their loved ones, and there were soon much larger battles to remember. Of this notable victory, General Artemus Ward wrote to the Massachusetts Council, quote, "It is worthy of special notice that the 14th of June, 1774, was the last day allowed for trading vessels to leave or enter the port of Boston through the cruelty of a British Act of Parliament, and that the 14th of June, 1776, through the blessing of God upon the operations of a much injured and oppressed people, was the last day allowed for British men of war or ministerial vessels to remain or enter within the said port, but as American prizes." The American Revolution is now 14 months old, and Boston, thanks to numerous militias, including Malden, is finally free. But while Benjamin Blaney and his Malden militia have been facing off against the British Navy, Captain Naylor Hatch and his Maldonians in the Continental Army are facing off against the British Army in New York and Canada. Throughout Malden's service in the war thus far, we haven't suffered any deaths due to combat, but surely that will soon change. How have Maldonians been faring in upstate New York these last couple months? Where will the British fleet strike next? Where else in America will Maldonians be sent? See you soon.